today to the UNLV College of Education Scholarship and Practice web series. We're very excited to share some information and actually interact with you today on how to turn your child's IEP into a successful partnership. So today's presenters, we're going to introduce ourselves briefly and why we're doing that. If you want to, in the chat, introduce yourselves to us. There's some questions on the screen if you like. What role do you have with children with disabilities, where you're joining us from, and what you hope to learn. So while we're talking, if you want to introduce yourselves, that'd be great. My name is Dr. Jenna Weglarz-Ward. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I teach in the early childhood and special education programs here. I'm also the parent of 4 amazing kids, all of which have had special education services. So I always say I've been on kind of every side of the table in this situation. I've been a professional, I've been a general educator, a special educator, and a parent, and now a researcher. So I'm excited to share some of my experiences today as well. So Dr. Van Ness, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Heather Van Ness, and I'm an assistant professor in residence, also in the EMS department. And I've worked in a variety of different settings, whether it's residential, juvenile corrections. I've worked in the school district as a school psychologist, and now am on faculty. So I am looking forward to having a conversation with you guys about how to begin this process and continue this process in a collaborative way.
Great. Welcome, everyone. My name is Joe Morgan. I'm an associate professor of special education, and I'm the chair of the Department of Early Childhood, Multilingual, and Special Education here at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I, like Dr. Weglarz-Ward, have had extensive experience working with parents and families throughout my career, both as a K-12 high school special education teacher right here in the Clark County School District, and then currently in my role as a faculty member at UNLV. So I'm looking forward to chatting with you all and sharing some tips and techniques and thoughts about engaging parents and families in the IEP process of kids with disabilities.
Thank you. And welcome everybody as you come in. I see some more people rolling in here today. As you enter, just tell us who you are. Welcome. It's great to see you, Penny. So also I want to let you know how you're going to interact with us today. So we're on Zoom. You are able to use the Q&A box, which you'll see there available to you. During the Q&A box, you're able to ask us questions directly to the presenters today that we'll see them and be able to respond to you. We'll either respond to you by typing back to you or out loud. You're also welcome to use the chat, which we're using right now. So those you can put in your experiences, responses, and questions, and you can send that to either everybody that's here by clicking everyone at the bottom, or to specific people that are attending. And then finally, if you want to share with us something out loud, you're welcome to raise your hand if you want to speak, and then we'll unmute you and you'll be able to share with us. So feel free to interact with us. That's what we're here for. We really want to really learn from you today as much as you learn from us. So let's get started. So our goals today are really to think about thinking about how family partnership really enhances the IEP process and special education. So we're going to review family partnership in general, and also what in educational legislation includes family partnership. We'll define partnership and engagement. Then we're going to spend a lot of time kind of describing barriers and strategies to help build partnerships in special education. So welcome everybody coming in the chat. So first, what I want you to do is just think about some terminology that we can use. So take a couple moments here and think about all of these terms that we use when either we're interacting with schools as families, or as schools are interacting with families themselves. Think about these different terminologies we use, and think about how they may change the way you interact with schools or families. Just take a moment to think about it. Also think if any of these terms are kind of engage or have more interaction, invite more interaction, or less interaction. So just take a moment, think on your own. You're also welcome to type any thoughts in the chat. I will ask you to do that in a moment. So take a moment, think about it. Yeah, thank you, Joseph. So Joseph's starting putting his thoughts in the chat. You're welcome to do that. So let's come back. Yeah. So which of these terms, does anyone feel that these terms are interchangeable and using them the same, or do these terms kind of invite different types of interactions? And you can put your responses in the chat. Joseph is saying that using family presence is the least interactive. Joseph, do you have a preferred term that you think invites more interaction between schools and families? Right, so thinking about partnership would leading to that. Penny is saying that we hear the word engagement a lot, but partnership is a great way to think about it. Yeah, partnership. So if we're using we're thinking about the word partnership. Why do you feel that partnership is a more kind of inviting term that will encourage kind of more different behaviors and practices than, for example, family participation or family information? What do you picture when you think about the word partnership versus some of those other terms? I think if you're a parent or a family member, thinking about what does that word do to what you think you want to have a relationship with, or the things that you do to build relationships with your schools. And if you're a teacher, thinking about when you use those words, what do those impact your practices with families? So I'll give us another minute here in our little chat discussion. You're welcome to continue chatting all the time. Yeah, I agree, Joseph. So Joseph has in the chat that partnership takes account both sides of input and values each other. And Yolanda, can say the same thing. We're together as partners, not one versus the other. So I think the directionality of some of these words are really important. And Penny says, equality is really important here. So sometimes when we use terms that we use, and those terms are used and they're related to our beliefs and then our behaviors and our practices that we use, we want things to be kind of bi-directional between families and teachers and other professionals instead of one person directing. So we've been talking a little bit about, during COVID especially, we got a lot of information. We got a lot of information from schools. We get a lot of information from things. Informing families is not necessarily engaging them, even in the content of the information, or engaging them in their child's learning, but really partnering with families and seeing, developing kind of joint goals and strategies and implementation and even accountability helps that both sides of those of families and schools work together and have equality there. So great. So I want you to think about these terms as we use them. I'm going to move on from the slide, but you're still welcome to use the chat whenever. So here are just some definitions, and we do see engagement and partnership being used more and more often. Actually, the National PTA Parent Teacher Association has some really good information about how they've shifted their terminology and are really focusing on engagement as opposed to parent participation and involvement to kind of elicit kind of these interactions here. So I'm not going to read everything on these slides, but you'll see really here kind of the heart of family engagement really is part of being systematic and including families in your activities and programs. So it's thinking about not just your one interaction, but systematically, how are you including families in your program, in your decision making, in your communications, in how you develop things. And you could take this into small things as your individual IEP team up to your classroom or your school. So for example, in our school district, in the Clark County School District, we include family engagement in our school organizational teams, and our SOT teams, we call them. So we're really systematically including in families. And then if we move it into family partnership, we're really looking at that relationship between families and not just parents, because families have lots of different people in them, and professionals where they agree to build on each other's expertise and resources. So if you feel, if you listen to that part of it, one, we're coming together and we're valuing the expertise of everybody on the team. The families bring expertise into their family, their preferences, their meaningful routines, their child's developments and interest, and what works for their family and their family's goals. Professionals bring expertise in different areas like speech and language development, in physical development, in behavior, addressing challenging behaviors, and obviously academics and education. So we want to leverage and build upon those expertise together. And then the last part of partnership really is for the purpose of making and implementing decisions together that will directly benefit the students. And then with that, as we're benefiting students, we're indirectly impacting the whole family as a system. So when our children are happy and thriving, families are also happy and thriving, and professionals are also happy and thriving. So everybody benefits when we work together. So we really want to think about this partnership too as families doing things together. We're doing things with families, not to families. So it's really important. Why I sometimes focus on language is because the language is reflective of what our practices and beliefs are. So if we keep saying, I'm going to do this to something instead of with family, that might impact how I approach a certain situation. So, whoop. Yeah, so I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Morgan.
Awesome. So thanks. And I think we're going to build for a minute, just so you can kind of, Dr. Weglarz-Ward shared this at the beginning, but we'll start in this big idea of a lot of the work that we do with families is about relationship, the ways that we build relationships, the ways that we understand each other, and the ways that we recognize the differences in culture between parents and families, the community, school environments, et cetera. And then we support parents and families and kids in navigating those variety of sectors in cross-cultural ways that are going to benefit the educational outcomes of the kids that we serve. And so we're going to start with that idea of building those stronger relationships and then narrow into how that's important for the IEP process. I think one key thing that we have to remember in education is that these partnerships are multi-directional. Jenna, if you want to tap it. Yeah. So oftentimes we consider parent and family partnerships as this interaction between the parents and families that we're working with, the student being served, and then the teacher who's teaching the student in the classroom. And so if you think about that, that is kind of the base way we think about parent-family engagement in school environments is how can we connect with each other to best serve the needs of the student with disabilities that we're serving in that particular setting. But if you really think about family and parent partnerships within the context of a school community, one important thing that research tells us is that schools have to recognize their nexus point across many community sectors. And so when we're engaging in family professional partnership building, we have to recognize that there might be this triune of relationships that we're focusing on in a particular IEP, but that these partnerships are multi-directional with other members of the community, whether indirectly or directly. So Dr. Weglarz-Ward, if you want to click. So there are other parents and families, right? One way that we build family and parent partnerships is understanding how the parents that we're working with communicate and intersect with other parents and families in the community. Are they talking with other parents and families of kids with disabilities? Do they have the opportunity to do that? Can they learn additional things from other parents and families who've kind of navigated that system before? Can they, we know that people feel more comfortable talking and asking questions sometimes with somebody who identifies in an affinity group that they do. And so they have a kid who's been newly diagnosed. Can they connect with other parents and families who can guide them in navigating that process, et cetera? The second part that we've got to consider is that there are also students interacting with other students that influence that partnership between parents and families and teachers. And so kids don't just have a relationship with us, they have a relationship with their peers in a variety of different placements and a variety of different things within the community environment that could be leveraged to improve outcomes within the IEP process. We also have to recognize that teachers have relationships with other educational professionals. And so they're taking the lessons learned from communication with parents and families and advocating to the administrators and working with other educational stakeholders to make sure that the IEP is implemented. And we've got to understand those intersectional partnerships. And then finally, we've got to remember, again, as I stated at the beginning, that this conversation and relationship between a parent and family, a teacher, and the student with disabilities that we're serving is also anchored within a larger community that influences parent and family resources they have access to, places they might go after school, things that we might be preparing students to do either in natural environments when they're younger or for transition purposes when they're getting to the the graduation side of their educational experience. And so really understanding that these partnerships have to take a variety of different perspectives in place. So there are some new theories about relationship building in public education for parents and families. And if you want to go to the next slide, it's called the social ecological relationship-based parent involvement strategy. And instead of, I think Dr. Weglarz-Ward, when she asked you that question at the beginning, right, I think you all nailed it in your chat conversation. I almost in my brain take that list of terms and flip it on its head like a continuum of options, right? Because sometimes parent information is what we need. What's the calendar for the year? When's homecoming? When are all these other activities happening? Involvement in that point is sharing that information so that parents know when and where they can get involved. To the other end, to your points in the chat, which I think are just brilliant and spot on, that really engagement of partnership so that we're all working towards the same goals for the kids that we're serving in the IEP. And too often, what schools do is they create spaces where parents can be involved, like I'm going to create a family night, right? The problem with the family night, and I think the idea of presence that got brought up in the chat is an important one, right? We create the calendar of events, you choose to come or not, and you interact with us in the ways that we've decided that's best for parents and families to interact with us on the behalf of their kids with disabilities. This idea of a social ecological relationship-based strategy is we first and foremost view the school as the place where parents can connect with all of those community stakeholders that can support them in their outcomes of their kids. And so it's not just a family literacy night to teach reading strategies. It's a family literacy night where parents want to come learn about family literacy, right? Where they've had a voice in saying, that's the topic that I want to talk about. There's space within that family literacy night for them to engage with other parents and families and share techniques and strategies and perspectives and ideas. They allow their kids to meet other families and other community members. They have the opportunity to access other resources within the community. So that idea of just saying on that continuum, right? I'm flipping that list again on a continuum. Instead of saying, okay, this event is scheduled to be information giving only, we start to think about how we can create these spaces of connection for parents and families with all of those other critical stakeholders in the community that support the outcomes of kids in their educational environments and within the IEP. Because we're one part of a team, I think. And I was a K-12 teacher, and I remember thinking that, right? Like, I'm one part of the team, but I've got all these things that I've got to check off. And it sometimes is easy for the school to center itself as we're trying to get all of these partners to align with what we're doing in the school. But it's almost flipping that idea on its head to saying, how can we create the school as the space where parents and families have the opportunity to meet all of these different partners? I've been doing some research recently in community-based schooling and how we can bring the resources of the community to the school campus. And that idea is really critical for this new kind of thinking about how parent and family involvement is. I have a colleague in politics who I respect very greatly, who often says, like, for 12 years, we've got kids on a school campus. And we tell parents and families, go there to talk to this parent, go there to get those resources, come here to get this. Why can't we start thinking about the school as the place to build relationships across all of those sectors? Because if they're there anyway, we can make it a lot easier for our multi-directional communication to provide those spaces to build those relationships. I think it helps us get to know the needs of the parents, families, and kids better. And it also helps us think through different resources that might be available through individualized education programming, right? It helps parents and families see what's available. It helps teachers see what's available. And it helps us conceptualize how we might build those bridges across sectors. So I think you're going to see as we go throughout the rest of this presentation, we really are taking that idea of parent and family involvement and saying, can we create these spaces where that multi-directionality of communication can be helpful? Sometimes as much as I think I have all the answers, I don't have all the answers, right? And it's another parent who's been through this before who can actually give the information that's really needed at that time. Yeah. So why do we talk about this? I think that's one important thing. And we reference this a lot, but I think we can go to the next slide. Sorry. The parent and family involvement is in just about every piece of legislation that is required for us to do in public education. And so the one that most of us are here to talk about is the IEP. And as all of you know, I'm preaching to the choir, but I always like to give parent shout outs here. We wouldn't be here in special education without the advocacy of parents, and the advocacy of parents saying kids with disabilities have a civil right to an equal education with their peers without disabilities. And it was parent organizations that rallied and fought and got that access to it. And parents are central to everything that we do in IDEA. I think sometimes we get caught up in the legalese of the process and forget the spirit of it, which is to create an individualized plan for kids in consultation with the people who know them best, their parents and families, on what can we do to help them achieve their fullest potential. And so we're here to talk a lot about the IEP process, but the Every Student Succeeds Act requires schools to set aside budget money to involve parents and families in programming. Head Start Act wants parent advisory boards. I think the key part on a lot of these legislations that we sometimes forget is that parent voice is critical to all of this. And so it's programming with parent voice. It's services with parent advocacy. It's making sure that parent perspectives are being heard on the campus so that they can engage in ways that are going to be meaningful for them and meaningful for the outcomes of the students that they serve.
And I just wanted to reiterate that none of these legislations would be possible without family advocacy. I mean, families were essential to all of these things, and all of our organizations, and people are talking about kind of disability-specific organizations, but also our general, like ARC and things like that. Those were all created of families for families. And we'll give you some resources at the end as well. But to know that sometimes in education, we get caught up in professionals, but remember that families have really driven a lot of what we do in education. So I just want to thank families for that work.
Well, and to kind of piggyback off of what Dr. Morgan was saying too, before you roll your eyes and huff, oh my goodness, she's going to go over the procedural safeguards. Rest assured, I am not going to go over the procedural safeguards. What I am using this slide to as really a springboard to connect what we were talking about previously, that all of these are procedural safeguards for parents. Yes, there is a booklet. Yes, we are handing it out at every MDT at various points. But the conversation is that we need to recognize and remind ourselves at every level, parents, teachers, that this is a living, breathing right? And so we review these, we hand them out, but we need to remind ourselves what the spirit is of each of these components within the rights. And so on the right-hand side, it really just does boil down to the concepts of being transparent in all of your interaction and all of your processes, protection for the families so that they know what their rights are, and constant communication and dialogue and interaction and engagement from all of the directions, right? From the parent to the school back to the parent. Being sure that families know that they have to provide permission in order for services, and so that we can engage in this concept of preparation. So the way that we do that is through the rights that we've enumerated here on the left-hand side. But again, we are providing those procedural safeguards, but we need to make sure that the families really understand what is contained within that 28-page booklet that we hand them. That was, let's be real, drafted by lawyers, and can be a bit of a snooze fest if you're reading it from front to back. But we need to make sure that we, as professionals, understand what's contained within that document so that we can be advocates for families, and so that families can in turn advocate for themselves and the best interests of their child. The parent participation is required within the procedural safeguards. It's required within the legislation. But beyond it being required, in order to develop the best IEP for students, it is needed because there's a perspective, information, and expertise coming from the family that we need in order to draft that document for them. The access to educational records, confidentiality of information in terms of protecting that information for families, ensuring that there's informed consent at every level. when explaining this to families, I always say, it's kind of a silly phrase, but just reminding families that they drive the bus in this process. We're here to support and provide opportunities and services, but really ensuring that we have their permission and support for evaluations, for providing services. And in order to provide consent, you have to have a really good understanding of what you're providing consent for. So ensuring that we explain what the process is, what it looks like, what it means. And then the reverse of that is that this process can be stopped at any point. You, as the family, have the right to stop and revoke consent. As much as you can give consent, you can also revoke consent. Because I know for a lot of families, it can be frightening. Am I starting a process and going down a path that I can't undo? And just reminding families that, again, that this is your bus. This is your family. These are your decisions, and we are here to support and provide information as much as possible. The same is true with communication, as we are identifying the language that is most comfortable for the family, and ensuring as much as possible that we are providing that information. All information. Meetings are held with services that allows for translation of that information. And then reminding families that they have the right, and I know this is where it gets uncomfortable potentially and a little bit scary for both professionals and for families. It's okay to disagree. We come from different perspectives as family members, as teachers. It's okay to disagree. And there are mechanisms in place for us to disagree. And really beginning to ease in and lean into that discomfort and have conversations about what is it that we're disagreeing on. Because at least in my experience, when you give each other enough space to have those conversations, you actually find that you may disagree on how to get there, but really there's largely agreement on what the end goal is. And so sometimes it's just a conversation about modifying the steps by which we are getting to the same place, and with transparency, being clear in how we get there. So this is really just, like I said, a reminder that those procedural safeguards are there for families, and those are family rights that need to be understood. And we need to explain how to get there and to make sure that families are comfortable advocating for their student, advocating for their child, because like I said, that discomfort comes in that agreement. Well, they're the professional, and that's where this cultural shift happens, right? And this understanding that each one of us, as Dr. Weglarz-Ward talked about at the beginning, each one of us offers expertise and brings information to the table, and recognizing that expertise and taking that time to listen. And we'll talk a lot about that this afternoon. How do we best listen to each other? And to that end, in addition to the legislation, this is also supported in professional practice through CEC, as well as the Division for Early Childhood, with regard to high leverage practices and recommended practices. From a professional standpoint, it is you are bound by these professional principles as well, with regard to ensuring that families that we are collaborating with families in the best way that we possibly can.
Okay, thank you. So I want to remind too that one reason that you'll see family partnership throughout all of our legislation and our practices and our parental rights and a lot of the activities that we do through education programs is that research is very clear that when you have strong family engagement, partnership, and involvement, that child outcomes are strengthened and for the long term. So one, parents are more engaged not only in their child's education, but in their school and their school community long term. And then children's outcomes across every academic and developmental area are improved long term. So that's why it's really important that we look at these. So next we're going to show you just some examples of some frameworks of partnership and components of partnership to help you think about, if you are a parent or as a professional, how can we be better partners? So first we're going to start with Ann and Red Turnbull's principles of partnership. And they have 7 principles of partnership that they discuss. And although none of them, they're all important. Trust is kind of the underlying component of partnership. And if you think about the relationships you have in your life, particularly your kind of most significant relationships that you have, I'm assuming trust is at the foundation of those. You have to be able to trust the other people you are partnering with so that you can do the things kind of Dr. Vanessa was talking about, being vulnerable a little bit to one, sharing information about you, sharing information about your routines and your families and what's important to you, and also sharing where you might be struggling or you might have questions, or being okay to disagree with each other and trust that even if we have a disagreement between each other, we still have a partnership together and we can still work through our agreed components there. So with trust, you see on the table here on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, what are some things that some people can do? And they're similar in some ways, and then other are a little bit different for different groups. But one, we want to celebrate each other's strengths for families and for professionals and what we're doing. But we also need to understand what each other is coming from and what they're doing. So for families, understanding what their schools are doing, and that knowing that the schools are doing what they think is best for their child and student, and that for professionals, that they also know that families are doing what is best for their child. And so we need to, one, think about when we do have perhaps negative thoughts about what's happening, where are those coming from? Are those coming from past experiences we've had, any biases that we may have towards education in general? Maybe you didn't have a great experience in school, and so you going back to school to partner with teachers and administrators might be intimidating to you because you didn't have that when you were a child growing up. So think about that as a bias, and then think about how can we work together to build that relationship with each other and build that trust, understanding your past experiences. So the next kind of partnering with trust is respect. You know, we can't have any partnership relationship without respect as well. So there are simple things to do is just respect each other. I think as other humans and other people is really important. So learning each other's names and understanding about your school or the family that you're working with is really, really important. And then respecting what that family or that professional brings to the table. What is their expertise and what we can do with that. Communication, we're going to talk a lot about communication today because it seems to be one area that is often a barrier. Communication is just key. We need to understand how to communicate with each other. And when you're a family, you may have multiple people that you're communicating with in your partnership or your IEP team. And so we need to know, how does communication work as a whole team? And then how does communication work with individual people? As professionals, we really want to be mindful about how families want to communicate with us and what works best for them. And if there's a family, if there's multiple adults in the family, that may mean that you use different modes of communication with different adults to make sure that we're all communicating with each other. Next, we want to talk about commitment. We want to be committed to this partnership. We have to be kind of all in on this partnership so that we can achieve the goals that we set together. So by committing to each other, we really want to follow through with the things that we've said. So if we said we're going to try a strategy or make suggestions, then we're going to do those things. If we say we're going to follow up with a phone call, well, then we'll follow up with that phone call and then share those experiences. It also might mean that sometimes, you can't get to something or have to rearrange, and that's okay too. But we also want to try to follow through eventually with those things. And then again, share your experiences. Next, we have advocacy, and this is really, really important with partnership. One, you need to advocate for yourself in your partnership and team. You need to make sure that you feel comfortable voicing your opinions and perspectives and sharing your experiences, having those agreements or disagreements or asking for different resources or different strategies. That's really important. You need to advocate for your own needs as a parent or a family member, and then by doing that, you advocate for your child's needs. So that's really important. For professionals, it's really vital that you advocate for the families that you're working with. And we know as families, we can see that, and that helps build our trust and respect with you when we see you advocating for us. And this might be our individual family or at the school or through the district. Next, we have equality, and this came up early when we were talking a little bit about talking about partnership versus other things, and you all in the chat brought up this idea of equality. And one of our biggest barriers in partnership is that sometimes there's a power imbalance. And this may be created where the team comes together and isn't using equality principles and not giving every people equal voice or equal time or listening to them equally. So you can do things like that by taking on leadership roles in your IEP. You can lead IEP meetings as a parent. You can take notes. You can help build your confidence. There's lots of strategies for you to do that. As professionals, we need to make sure we provide information to families so they can lead and have equal opportunity to make decisions and do that. But we have to give them the information to do that. We also want to look at equality to make sure, again, we're understanding where people are coming from, their cultural experiences, their own personal experiences with education, with professionals, past experiences that they've had with their child in other programs, and understand that they may be coming to the partnership with other perspectives. Perhaps their cultural perspective is that teachers make all the decisions for my child's education, right? And that may be the perspective they're coming with. So we need to work with that family to learn about how they feel about this equality principle and where we can balance the decision making so that parents are very equal in their decision making, but in a way that they're comfortable. And finally, competence. It's really important. I know that for special educators, we're trained in special education. We know lots and lots of things. There's always room to learn more, particularly to learn more about family practices, family partnership, collaboration, being culturally appropriate and responsive. For families, most of us who have children with disabilities didn't know a lot about special education before we had a child with a disability. And I'll be honest, I had a master's degree in special education when I started with my youngest in early intervention. And even with that, I still didn't know enough being on the parent side of some of those things in our Part C program. So with that, we have to build our competence. One, bring our expertise, and then learn what else do we need to learn, and then find ways to learn that in a way that works for us. For families, there's lots of different opportunities to build your kind of confidence and competence in your knowledge, whether it's in the special education system, whether it's about your child's disability or developmental delays specifically, whether it's about parent leadership and advocacy, and we'll give you some resources on the end with that. And really setting high expectations for ourselves and for our children. And professionals, we still need to continually make sure that we're addressing our competence and being as competent as we can. So those are those 7 principles of partnership that you can kind of look at in your current partnership and see, what things are happening that are really strong in our partnership with my IEP team. And then what are some examples of how those principles we can see within each other in our partnership? And then what are some principles that perhaps we need to work on so that our partnership is more functional, more equal, for example, more trusting, more respectful, or stronger communication?
In addition to that trust piece too, one of the things that I've seen quite a bit that I think that we can continue to work on and is sometimes an issue, and we'll touch on this a little bit later on today too, is as it pertains to that component or that principle of trust. I think that regardless of which side you're on, right, if you're the professional or the parent, no one likes surprises. And so as much as possible, if we can begin that dialogue or continue to have that dialogue about what our thoughts are, there is this false notion that having a conversation prior to a meeting, it has something to do with determining eligibility or predetermining services. And it really is just a conversation about the data that we've collected so far. especially going into something like an eligibility meeting or an IEP meeting. Families are concerned. They're not sure what to expect. They're not sure what everyone at the table is going to say. So as much as we can give information before we're sitting down to the table, so that families come to the table with thoughts and questions. And then the reverse is true. As much as we can have that conversation from families about what their concerns are, the professionals can come to the table prepared and ready to respond to those questions and concerns in a way that allows for healthy and more elevated conversations about what is best for the child.
And I think
Penny made a great point. And Penny, I was going to say this in just a second, but I think it fits here. Because so you're going to see we're recommending global practices, building community and relationship, et cetera. I think the key part is that the IEP is the document that guides everything else that happens across the year. And so I think sometimes we center on the IEP meeting, and Penny, I'm not saying you, I'm saying in practice, I think we sometimes say, we've got to get this document done. It's a legally required document. But as we mentioned earlier, that's not the spirit of the document. The spirit of the document is an ongoing plan that's individualized. And so I think as we're talking about this, and Penny, you're 100% right. These take time. When we get into some of the barriers and things, to think through, time is one of them. But to allow the IEP to be what it was designed to be, it takes this time to build those relationships. And I think too often, my opinion, and I think there's research to back me up, I always try to quote if it's Joe Morgan's opinion based on how I've read the research or if I know this to be a fact. My opinion is I think some of the communication falls apart at the IEP meeting because we didn't do the previous work at relationship building. And so we're trying to get a document done without fully knowing what's the goal that we're trying to, what are the goals? Remember that multi-directional communication. What's the goal of what we're all trying to accomplish? So then when we get to the meeting, we know each other and we know how to collaborate to it. So Penny, I echo you. You're 100% right. The time is there. I would advocate to everybody in the room. I think it's a parent and family and teachers, et cetera. This is an ongoing across the year process to build all of these relationships. And we can't just isolate these activities to the IEP because I think those relationships take so much time to build. So you're 100% right. And trying to build relationship with family in a 30-minute IEP on Google Meets is not a way to build relationship. I agree with you 100%. And so I think some of our recommendations across this time are going to be about, okay, once the IEP is done, how do we bring the educational program to life and make sure all stakeholders are there implementing their portions of it?
Yeah, I think I was going to say the same thing. So I mean, anything takes time to build, and I think relationships in particular take time to build. And I think this concept, and I think this concept of the IEP being a single moment in time that has to be done. But thinking about the IEP as IEP is an individualized education program. And it's a process. It's a relationship between a family, the family, the child, and all of the professionals with that child that really takes that time to build. And I do think, especially with IEPs often, being scheduled very quickly, that meeting is actually not the time to build the relationship, but to spend other times building the relationship. So then the IEP meeting is a meeting where you can use your relationship to create and create goals and have joint decision making and plan for implementation. And I think Yolanda brings up a very good point when you're when you're thinking about especially your rights to an advocate, is that you can always ask for additional meetings or ask for this meeting to be, we need to end, our time is limited today. Let's plan another day to complete this IEP, the IEP document process. So that's really important to know that family can act to do that. And I think someone brought up Nevada PEP already, which we'll talk about, which is our Parent Information and Training Center in Nevada. And they help, help you learn advocacy skills and see what you can do, but they also provide advocates for you to bring with you to these things. So I'm going to talk a little bit, but just to give these kind of foundational things. And again, I think if you ever have a relationship, you're like, well, of course. I think in education, particularly when we were in distance education, this was very challenging. But still, especially as your children get older, when you're spending less and less time in the school, building relationships are challenging. So we need to find different ways to build these relationships. Particularly, thinking about, of course, we can use technology, particularly right now, to help build those. But one, you need to learn about each other. You need to learn about each other. I always say as real people, because we are real people that have lives. And so when we're thinking as a family member, like, how can we share what our family is like and what's meaningful for us, and what are our priorities for our family and for our child, and for schools and for your teachers, what is a priority, and how does what are things that happen in your school that's really important. So, and also thinking about, obviously, what's the role in your child's life and in their education. And obviously, if you're here as a family member, you are that child's, family member, parent, or guardian, or sibling. That's really important. And then, but how does that connect to their education and their, especially in their academic needs? So how do those bridge together a little bit? And what role do you want to have in that process? I think what's really important when I'm working with families is that I want to build their capacity to support their child's development and learning, and then advocate for their child's needs, because your children's teachers will change over time, and maybe you'll have the same teacher for a year, maybe a couple years. I always say 3 years is usually sometimes common. So we need to be able to, as our team shifts, when we shift to different grades and we shift to different schools, how can we still support our child's education and do that? And so for professionals, we need to understand how we can build their capacity, parents' capacity to do that, so when they leave us, they can still have these partnership experiences. So I think for families too, share about what your typical day or week is, so that families know that you really, like, what is important and feasible, and how can things that translate from our schools translate into our home environment as well? How can we embed strategies into our daily routines? Do we have time? And are there struggles that you have during your daily routines or week that the school could help support you with, or find you referrals or other resources for? For schools, it's really important for families to understand what your routines are, and not just your schedules. Like, we can get a printout schedule of when classes are happening, but what are the routines that are happening? How are transitions happening between subjects, or between classes, or between lunch and class and PE or other activities that they have? Those are really important to have. What's really important too, I think we're talking about eligibility, IEPs as well, but what are your child's strengths and what are your family's strengths? Those are really important, that we work with those so that we can highlight those and remember that we are building the child's strengths and also addressing the areas of needs. So, and that's something I think about for a good partnership is, what do I need to be a good partner? What are some things I need to work on in this partnership? And then I can share those with the people that I'm partnering with. And once you have that strong foundational relationship, you could say, like, I'm really struggling with communication. Like right now, like, I don't feel like we're communicating. I really need to work on using different modes of communication. Or I'm really having a hard time with this commitment piece where I just have a hard time following through. You're giving me all these great suggestions, but I just can't find a way to follow them through, or we're just too busy, or I can't remember how you did that when you showed me that one time. So think about, what do I need to be a good partner, and then ask for that help with your partnership. Obviously, communication all the time and regularly. So again, not just we don't just want the IEP to be our only communication, right? Prior written notice and the IEP meeting. We need to set up a regular communication, and how does that work, and how can that be functional? We have a lot of different ways to communicate with people right now. And so I think you should really leverage the ones that really work for you, so that you can communicate regularly. And then again, I always say this, really important. Be honest about what's meaningful and feasible for your family. And if you're in a school situation, what's feasible for your program, right? What'll really work? And what really, you're like, that isn't going to work for us. Or so can we think of something different, or can we think of a different way, or can we embed, these literacy skills in another way that's more functional for us? So that way it gives us more chance of everybody being able to follow through with the things that we've planned. There's lots of things happening in the chat, so that's great. So one strategy I invite you to look at, and we're giving you some resources to do that too, is figuring out how to share your family story. And I will say I work in early childhood, and particularly when I work in Part C, we spend a lot of intimate time with families. And as children get older, when they're in preschool and then in elementary, we don't learn as much about the family as a whole. And so we really encourage families to tell their story. And this could be used, into your IEP team to really share what's important to your family, what you really love about your family. And also what's meaningful and what your goals are for your family. You also could use this in larger advocacy things if you're looking at things with the school district or even for state and federal policy, sharing your story. As we talked about before, IDEA, 30% of testimony in the IDEA initial and reauthorizations of that legislation were family stories, families telling what's important, why is special education important to them, what works, what doesn't work. And so here are some things to think about for you telling your family story. And it doesn't have to be like, a whole book, although I'm sure you could all tell your whole book about your family. But you could think about in 3 minutes, how can I really tell my family story? Or what about if I had 15, 20 minutes to tell my family story? What would I really have there that's really important? And thinking about what are really great moments that have happened in your family's journey in special education. What have been incredible challenges and what have been solutions to those challenges is really important. Another really effective way to help tell your family story or share information about your families or even communicate between the different partners that you have is to use videos or pictures. We live in a world where we take pictures, we carry around cameras, right, and video cameras all over. I was actually working with a little one the other day, and I asked her, we were pretending to take pictures, and I went like this. I was like, oh, you guys can see it. I was like, oh, she's like a camera. And she was like, no, pressing a button on her iPhone. I was like, oh, children are really, they take pictures, they're comfortable getting their pictures taken most of the time, and families take lots of pictures. Families are, pictures and photos and videos are really impactful to see what a family is doing. I have a colleague that has done this work, and we're currently we're talking with families about the impact of COVID on their families of children with disabilities. And we have them share photos with us about things that have been really great, things that haven't been really great. And it helps really kind of share a commonality and give us something that's comfortable to talk about and be able to see things. I can see my child doing something. I can see them, doing strategies with the physical therapist or the speech and language pathologist. I can see them doing those things. Here's what it looks like at home. Here's how we tried it and it really worked. Or here we tried it and it was a disaster. How can we do that? So thinking about using pictures might be really beneficial for you and your team to really build partnership and understanding, and then also just use communication. So there's a resource here. When you do get the handout for this, anything that has that line on it that's red, those are live links that will link you to lots of different resources about the things that we've talked about today. So I know that we have these things going on in the chat, so I don't know if we want to stop and address those. I don't know if Heather or Joe, if you want to talk about some of the chat that's happening.
We were just kind of going back and forth about all of the things that we're discussing and how, especially with those principles, how we can put them into place, how we can put them into application. And just constantly remembering and reminding ourselves exactly what we've been discussing, that the IEP is a document, but that it doesn't drive the process, right? It's that relationship, it's that conversation about what's in the best interest of the child that we are really putting into place into this document. One of the things that I had mentioned in the chat, and I've experienced myself, and we all experience these looming deadlines, right? The 1 year IEP IEP timeline, and we have to get this done. And so we have to get it done before this date and in this time frame. And we'll talk about this as one of the barriers here in a moment. But those time frames, they're not arbitrary, but they can be modified if everyone is on board. If the family and the professionals understand that we need more time to do what's in the best interest of the child, as long as that information is statused and everybody's on the same page, again, going back to those principles of trust and communication and collaboration, everything will be okay in terms of compliance. Because again, I would rather have an not compliant IEP that is being drafted in the best interest of the child than a very compliant IEP that really has nothing to do with what that child needs. So it's beaten into our heads, right? That we have to have and follow these timelines. But of course, in terms of the legislation and the requirements for procedural safeguards and protections for parents, we have to have that in place and provided. But if we're working towards a document that really takes into consideration all of the needs of the student that the student is presenting, we will always be okay. You will come out on the good side of anything as long as a team, we are moving in the best interests of that kiddo.
Great. Thanks. So we're going to continue on with some recommendations for strategies. And so the research, Joyce Epstein has done a lot of research on parent and family involvement in a variety of different ways. And she and her team have found 6 main categories of ways parents can be involved in school environments. And so the first is the parenting involvement category. And this is where schools can work with parents and families to create environments at home and in the communities to support this idea of children as students. And so I think it's that multi-directional conversation of kids are kids, and then they're also students at home. So how do we make sure there are spaces for learning available within parent or within home and community environments? How do we work with parents and families to identify those spaces and help them develop the skills to support their children as students? The second area that they've identified is communicating. And these are our methods to engage in school to home and home to school communicating. I want to draw your attention back to that multi-directionality of communication. That we're finding avenues for perspectives to be shared across a variety of different settings in a variety of different formats. The third is volunteering. And so this is recruiting and organizing parent help and support in a variety of ways to achieve educational outcomes in the classroom or the school environment. The fourth is learning at home. And so then this is similar to parenting. This is similar to supporting seeing children as students. But this is more developing skills for parents and families to make sure that they know what to do to support their students' academic needs. And so one common thing we did when I was teaching was if there was a behavioral intervention plan, and we were working across environments to make sure reinforcements were similar for specific behaviors, that we made sure that parents and families and other team members knew how to implement the reinforcements, had access to the tools that we were using in school, et cetera, so that they could continue to extend the reinforcement and intervention system in the home environment so we could develop that continuity. The fifth is decision-making, which is the inclusion of parents and families in decision-making processes about curriculum and instruction at a school and classroom level, but then also on what's important for the needs of their students that they're advocating for. And then the final is engaging in collaborations with the community. And so, as I said earlier, making sure we as a school know the resources that are available to parents and families outside of the school, that we've made connections with them, that we have opportunities. Shelley talked about a binder and I think it's a great idea, right? Knowing what's available in and around the school that parents and families can access and spaces that are there. I did some work with some colleagues recently on developing asset mapping processes and having teachers really understand what are the assets in the school community that are available, asking parents and families what assets they use in the community environment, and figuring out how to integrate those assets into the school, particularly so that we can support outcomes of kids. But so these are the 6 common types of parent involvement that I've identified throughout the literature. So I want to go to the next slide and take away the definitions and just open it up for a minute of chat and reflection. What are some things that you found in any of these categories that you have found to be effective in getting parents and families of kids with disabilities involved? And then what are the barriers that you might have identified related to some of these particular types? Like, for example, I'll give you a leading example that's going to take us into the next slide. But for example, volunteering. A classroom teacher might say, I need volunteers to come in and help make copies and pass things out and volunteer on an event. But one of the barriers for that might be parents and families working may not be able to have the time to come into the classroom at that specific time, may not feel comfortable doing that, et cetera. And so that might be one barrier to a common type of parent involvement that may not actually be accessible to parents and families as they want to get involved. So what are some things in any of these categories or just globally that you found to be effective for involvement? And then what are some barriers that are identified in getting more involved in educational programming? We'll just give it like a minute and a half to, if you have any thoughts, share them or. Yeah, Penny, I like that idea. Celebrations. I think I was chatting with a student this summer who talked about like doing the celebrations that the school is in a predominantly Latinx community, but the celebrations they have for students are not connected to the culture of the community. And so establishing celebrations that parents and families would want to come to, want to engage in, and really like, again, that idea of making the school the hub of the community. How can we do those things? And then inviting people so that they can learn about different cultures, connect with different people, et cetera. I think that's super important. Yeah. Lots of communication, Shelley. I think one key thing is communication in a preferred mode. I think that's important. And in an accessible mode, like if we're teaching multilingual students whose parents may not be native English speakers, are there other ways we can communicate content? Are there other methods and metrics? I know I'm those of you that are teaching, I'm a dinosaur. So some of the modern ways of communicating to people, I would not even think of, but are we finding ways to communicate with parents and families in ways that are accessible and modern and interesting to them? Yeah. Oh, Joseph, that's great. Getting students involved. I love that, especially with that idea of multi-directional communication, right? Getting students involved and framing the conversation for the adult. That's cool. So that they can really, because our ultimate goal is student independence, right? And so if we could start teaching students to advocate as well and kind of lead some of those conversations, I think that's a great way to make homeschool connections for kids. Yep, that's awesome. Yeah, Joseph, I think that's, especially as kids get older, having to connect with a variety of different people in a variety of different formats, right? I worked at a high school. And I may do it one way, but the teacher next door does it another way. And so the parent has to figure out how to communicate with me and the teacher next door in our preferred modes. And so seeing if there are ways that we can streamline and make sure we're getting similar information out at the same time or similar access points, that's a good barrier. Good idea. It's not a good barrier. It's a good identified barrier.
I think what's interesting too is if you're a parent or a teacher, to understand like what are the communication systems that your school is currently using, and then learning how to use those a little bit, or helping parents learn how to use them. So I know like in Clark County, using Infinite Campus and things like that. Yes, we can all learn how to log on, but then what do we do when we get in there? And going through it with parents, because that's what our school district uses, and then using obviously other modes of communication as well are really important too. But it's also really important to learn, like, if, I have a lot of things to say, like, just check Infinite Campus, just check Infinite Campus. And I'm like, okay, well, what is it? What am I checking? What am I looking for? How do I see if there's a problem, or how do I contact my teacher? So thinking about what your school already uses too, and understanding like, how is this working? How do we need to get this to work better to use it as a communication tool more than just a reporting tool? That's some of the things that we in our district were required to use, but to use those more effectively.
Yeah. Great. Thanks for those examples, and we're going to talk a bit more about reframing in just a second.
So to that point, really, we've really just been talking about the common barriers and possible solutions in this conversation, in the chat. You guys have come up already with what we've identified as common barriers, the time and energy, and understand as we conceptualize what that means for each of us. The time and energy that we have as professionals, as teachers, but also what do the families have available in terms of resources, and understanding that and reminding yourselves that they might be on different schedules, that they may be working night work. So how do we have this conversation about what is a good time to have that communication? And to discuss again that communication piece about what it means. Yes, check Infinite Campus, as we were just talking about, but what does that information in there mean, and how something simple as how assignments are logged in Infinite Campus might be different for each teacher. And so how does the teacher then reach out to the family and explain, this is what missing really means, or this is what a 50% really means. It doesn't mean that your child really got a 50%. It just means that that's the minimum grade for a missing assignment. So as we think about and begin to reframe how we develop these or redevelop these partnerships, we are all very busy and we are all very tired, period. So understanding that and going into building those relationships with grace and understanding, and asking the question, how best can I communicate with you? What is the best time? As Dr. Weglarz-Ward mentioned, what's the preferred method of communication? Because maybe calling during my prep isn't the best time to reach you. Maybe it's easier if we can do a text communication, or and identifying what that looks like. And going back to the time and energy, it may be different for each family. It may be different for each adult member of the family, as we've already discussed. But if we have, and we have to establish that at the beginning of the year, in the beginning of our relationship, so that we can continue that method of communication throughout that year or that time with the family. And coming towards a common understanding of various processes within the IEP development, reevaluation. As students are involved in special education for longer periods of time, we begin to develop these assumptions that families must already know, and just kind of revisiting what those rules are, revisiting what the options are, so that we can constantly be transparent in where we're going and with that direction. I want to be aware of time, so I want to make sure we get lots of questions. Lessons learned from COVID. So we could take the next 4 hours really to discuss all of the barriers and problems and stress that resulted from COVID and the education process with COVID. But I'd like for us to reflect a little bit about what we've learned and how we can find the light from this experience and move forward in continuing to build relationships with families, with teachers, based off of what we've learned and had to establish. So certainly family and school partnerships are essential, but how we build them can be more innovative than it's ever been. We've been forced to use technology in ways that were unfamiliar. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the folks that are in attendance right now. Would you have been able to go to a seminar that was at a physical space rather than logging in virtually? I would venture to say the same is true with families. Can we provide education and support to them using technology, recording those sessions, recording examples of how to log in, using Screencastify, how to log into Infinite Campus, talking with them about what it means, and then posting it on your classroom website or posting a link and sending it out. We can grow from this terrible situation that we've all been thrust into and build on these barriers and really create strengths and opportunities for our families. again, in looking at, we were kind of in jest. I probably shouldn't share this, but I will because that's what I do. That it's going to be difficult for us to have conversations about balance with work and families because I will speak for myself. I struggle with that. I think that we're all constantly working to improve and grow. So having that honest, transparent communication, again, with all of the partners at the table with regard to how can we balance this process, how can we balance this for the best interests of the child and make it work for all of the team members.
Yeah, and I think that leads into reframing, right? And I think Dr. Vanessa's lessons learned there are so important, right? Never in my decade plus long career in education have I heard people talking about the integral part of parents and families in education of their kids, and also the integral part of teachers in the education of kids, right? I think a lot of what we saw in COVID was negative disruption, but I think there were some positive things that I'm hopeful as a field we can capture and move forward, right? I agree with the things in the chat box, like 30-minute important meeting over Google Meets may not be the best way to collaborate and make sure everybody's voice is being heard. But 15-minute ability to video chat with somebody that I might not ever have been able to, right? Those are great things that might be able to make their way into our common practice. Because, there's, I think Dr. Weglarz-Ward told me this during COVID, right? I've seen some students of mine that I never would have seen before because we only did communication via email. But now it's so easy to say, let's hop on Zoom for 7 minutes. It won't take long. You don't have to drive all the way down here, but let's just chat. And then that way I can answer your questions and then get to know you. So I think there are ways we can use technology to break some of those barriers. But I think one of the most important things that we need to reframe is the role of parents and families. I think for a long time, we've treated parent and family involvement in schools as they need to come to us to do what we are asking them to do on behalf of their kid. I think one of the most powerful things we can do in education is to reframe that and recognize the critical role that parents and families teach in building the educational capital of their kids, and how we can partner together to make sure that we're working towards the same ultimate goals across those settings. So McKenna and Millen have proposed 2 ways to engage parents and families, and they kind of separate them out into 2, and I think they're important for our work. So one of them is to recognize opportunities for parent voice to be heard. I think that's something that we're often missing in parent and family engagement conversations, where it is getting parent opinions about things, getting parent and family perspectives on policies, et cetera. Providing space for parents to just come share frustrations. I know when I was a facilitator, one thing, and it was hard sometimes, right? It was hard to sit in a room and listen to all the frustrations because I felt bad. I'd start to get defensive, right? All of those things. But I always challenge myself to say, I need this space to hear it, and they need a space to tell it, right? And so giving those spaces where concerns can be heard uninterrupted without defense mechanisms in play, and because it A, helps us really understand how we're approaching conversations, and then B, helps us troubleshoot better, because if we can get to some of the underlying reasons behind the concerns, we can begin to address those. So providing a variety of different ways for parent voice to be heard. But then also particularly related to the IEP process, Nevada PEP's come up a couple of times. I see a fantastic Nevada PEP rep on the webinar right now, right? Building opportunities to develop parent voice. I think, Yolanda, I think it was you that gave the example of like asking for the reconvening, knowing what your rights are, knowing what you can advocate for, et cetera. Those are all skill developments so that parents can use their voice and agency to be able to advocate for that. I'm a strong believer that schools are responsible for that. I know we don't often want to open all that up, but we have to. If we want active members in partnership for students, we need to make sure that they've got the voice and advocacy to be able to do that. The second part of their parent and family involvement technique is parent presence. So these are the opportunities for parents to be involved in education. And I think what's important about McKenna and Millen's frameworks is they note that the parents and families can be involved in education, not just through on-school campus activities, but in a variety of ways at home. So there's a way for parents to be present and supporting educational outcomes without physically coming to a family literacy night, right? There's critical teaching that's happening related to the culture of the home within students, right? Communication and interacting with others, et cetera, is all being taught at home. Really understanding how to model and mentor behavior within the community is happening at home. So there are ways to support parent presence. And so it's important to reframe that so we're allowing voice and allowing presence. Dr. Weglarz-Ward, if you want to skip 2 slides. I'll just give you a couple of examples of reframing. So when we think back to those 6 categories of parent involvement, we often run workshops or learning nights. Do those have to be workshops? Do they have to be the format that we've always had them in? Can they be done virtually? Can they be done with screen recordings? Can they be done where parent to parent? It's like a train the trainer model where a group of parents comes and then they're available to support other parents and families. Have we ever asked parents how they want to attend information, what information they want to hear? Volunteering. Are there ways to volunteer to support goals of the school without actually physically having to come to campus during the school day? Can I make materials? If I buy the materials as the teacher, can I send them home and the parents and families can work to build them together? Can I still volunteer to support the initiatives without actually having to physically be on the campus? If you go to the next one. Decision making. Are we actually being collaborative? Are we just telling them what we're doing and not actually getting that feedback in place? I think all of these are critical reframing metrics for involvement to understand. And I think Dr. Van Ness said it there, right? We've also got to recheck our perspective sometimes on both levels, on both sides, right? I think it often comes from the a multi-directional, but I think education oftentimes views parents and families from a deficit perspective when talking about educational outcomes of kids with disabilities, because they say, well, we're the experts, we'll tell you what to do. But as we said earlier, there's only one expert on a kid and it's their family. And so instead of approaching from a deficit, figuring out how we can leverage the assets they bring to the table. If I'm teaching in a community and I'm not a member of the community, I'm not going to know the cultural capital and cultural norms to be able to teach in my classroom environment. But I can partner with the critical stakeholders within that to integrate those assets into my educational experience or invite them to do it in virtual ways, in-person ways, et cetera. So I think a lot of this reframing is just reconceptualizing the roles of parents and families in the educational process.
And I think, we've talked a lot about really kind of reconceptualizing and rethinking how we're interacting between families and professionals here. And I think one really major reframe we could say is it's not us and them, it's we. We are on this team together. It'll help us reframe the work together too. So I'm just going to, there's just a couple more slides. I just want to be mindful of time and make sure you have time to ask more questions too. These are just some things to think about during the IEP process. Again, remember, it's not just the meeting or team, but really going in with team spirit and thinking we're going to team together here. Then you could see the other things in there, but gathering and reviewing materials, preparing and asking questions. There's a webinar here at the bottom that's by one of my colleagues, Megan Burke at the University of Illinois, and she has some really good information about thinking about how to even prepare for interactions with your IEP team. And so there's a webinar you can watch and resources. One thing she talks about is just having a parent input statement. So especially if you don't feel comfortable just talking out in the middle of an IEP meeting, here's a statement of what I've prepared and what I really see and want to do. So, and really think about this. And again, sharing celebrations. And I don't think sounds like anybody's new to IEPs. But here's a really nice, just a short video here for families. And this is from the National Center for Parent and Training Information Centers, just on navigating IEP meetings to the beginning. So let's get through. So I'm going to go through just a couple little resources here, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Obviously, there's others in here, but we've talked about Nevada PEP. Please go check it out. If you're in Nevada, that's our center. If you're not in Nevada or you want to look at resources from other places, other states, you can go to Parent Hub, which is the national website for all of the IDEA parent training information centers and also the community resource centers. So there's that, lots of really good resources, and also if you're in other states, finding either your state program offices or your community resource centers are there. This is a webinar, and I work with the Military Families Learning Network a lot, and although they do really provide really rich information if you are working with military families, also some of the things are really kind of generalized for all families, but here's a really good webinar about really advocating for your needs and communicating your needs with professionals. And then lastly, these are just some additional resources on how for you as families to get more involved. The Council for Exceptional Children, which is the used to be only professional organization for special educators, now has kind of reconceptualized its membership to include family members as really valuable members of the organization. And so they now have a low-cost membership option for families. So you can join what we call CEC. And then if you have, you could join different divisions as well to get more specialized information. Family Voices is a really great family-led organization that has resources, but also trainings with virtual. Everything has been great because it's translated online and also in person in each state. Training for families and also schools and programs to support family leadership and family advocacy. Finally, I want to talk about some of the kind of sharing your family information and stories is from the Early Childhood Personnel Center and their family leadership cohorts. The information they share is not specific necessarily to families of young children. They're really valuable for all families of children with disabilities. So you can look it up there. And last, this is just a short article that I really like to share with families and professionals by Janice Fialco, who is a parent of a now adult child with disability. And she kind of reconceptualized, she talks about partnership using the metaphor of dance and really brings in the perspective of a parent and then contrasts that with the perspectives of a professional. I really like this article. I know I had to include in here. I use it with my students who are new to special education and particularly to help them understand partnership and what we're bringing to the table, especially with new partnerships. So I just invite you. It's a short article. It's kind of fun to read. So now we're just going to open it up for questions. We have about 8 minutes left here. I know there's some questions in the chat too. But please let us know if you have questions. You can use the Q&A box or the chat box if you don't mind everyone seeing your question. You can also raise your hand and our colleague Youngbuck will unmute you. So I see Linda has a question.
Go ahead. Yeah, Lydia.
Oh, Lydia, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
More than a question, I wanted to add something. I think that I find it to be like a little missing link. I believe that communication is exceptional. I mean, that is the root of everything. However, also it is vital that you show that you care. And it starts with the child. The child knows and hears you and actually talks to the parent. The child is actually speaking to the parent and saying, oh, Miss Adame this, Miss Adame that, oh, Miss Adame this. And I think it's vital that parents understand that this teacher, Miss Adame, is actually paying attention to the child, is interested in the child, wants to help the child. I think that sets the plate for all conversation because as a parent, I want a child that talks about their teacher and one that I want to approach and so that we can work together.
I think that goes back to that multi-directional communication you were talking about, right? Because I think you're 100% right. If there's if I come home and say, oh, this teacher always ignores me, et cetera, then I try to go engage in an IEP. I know that. And so that influences it. But if I go in and say, oh, they've got a strong relationship, they're doing everything possible, and they're really getting involved and getting invested, that also changes my approach to how I do collaboration. So I think you're 100% right. Ensuring all those critical partners have critical communication is important.
Yeah.
But like I said, I believe that the child has an important piece in this whole interaction. Yeah. So I think it's very important for teachers in this situation to actually show that they care, and because the kids will transmit that, they will get that, they will feel it, and they will translate that to the parent. Mm-hmm. And I think that's vital for developing that relationship that we're talking about.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it also goes back to like the principles of partnership too, about that trust and respect and commitment. And I think to extend that too, that we're showing that we care about the family. So, and even those little things like using their names or remembering like their job schedule. So when you go to schedule a meeting, you're not going, we had one year where the teacher, this is not a great example, but she kept forgetting, like my husband we worked different shifts. So he worked at night and I worked during the day. So it was hard for us to find time. And we felt like every time we had a meeting, we had to remind the teacher that our schedules were this way. And then the next teacher was like, oh yeah, I know that your husband works in the evening, so let's figure out a time that works for you that does that. And it just kind of showed that you're like, oh, well, you actually care about us and listen to us. And that commitment makes a huge piece when you're going in to try to partner with people. And then to say like, oh yeah, Grayson came home today and he was just talking so much about his teacher. He really is really enjoying this class. How can we make his strategies really work in this class, because we want this to work out so well. So I think that's really, I think those little things you kind of forget a little bit about. I was talking to my students actually before parent-teacher conference day, and I said, don't forget the power of just genuinely asking someone how they are and how are things going, and what can I do? What can I help you with right now?
I think one thing. I think accessing Nevada PEP or parent resource centers, wherever you're at, they're in all states funded by IDEA. I think one thing, I think that when we were talking about advocates earlier, it's where those advocates are super critical, right? Because you can learn the information, right? Nevada PEP does a variety of different workshops and training sessions on parents on how to navigate the IEP process. But then having somebody sitting there with you and showing you where to ask questions, reminding you of what your rights are. And I think that helps build that partnership in play. So I think that's part of it. I think if you're an educator in the room, I think knowing, I always remembering that like you might have the legalese parts of it down and not everybody does. So stopping critically and asking for questions, opening those up for answers, maybe doing a pre-meeting where you can kind of talk about what's going to happen. Tell them where the different perspectives can be shared. I think those are super important. So I think my two main things would be the professional development and then those supports from the community advocates and having people there that can help you navigate that process. And then on the educational side, really building in that time so that parents can feel like there is space for them to ask questions, that they can get clarifications, et cetera, and then prepping them for where specific things might come up in that IEP meeting. I think that's super important on the educational side of it.
Yeah.
And then modeling it too. I'm sorry. And building in that capacity during the meeting, right? So when you're going to ask a question, then model what some potential responses might be to throw those questions on them, and expecting these answers right off the fly, again, doesn't help. So as much as possible, if you can prepare, send home some questions that might come up that are going to come up in the IEP meeting, but then also modeling what might be some examples of what you see as the child's strengths, or what are they really good at home. And a lot of times parents, especially for that strengths component, they're searching for is an amazing artist. No, they respond when you ask them the question the first time, or it doesn't have to be very large, and getting them to understand that any contribution and recognizing all of those strengths is really important. So supporting them and building in that capacity through the process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's about that you cannot have a true partnership if you're coming in from a power imbalance, right? I think it's just critical that we have to remember. And so I may have had all these years of education, and if I want to have a true partnership, I've got to make sure all the other members of the stakeholder group, we're all talking at the same place. One thing I always tell my students is in true collaboration, practice radical humility all the time. We can learn something from everybody, and we've got to make sure that everybody's got the space to share that voice. And I think giving them space to ask questions, learn what they need to do, et cetera, really ensures that we can engage in that true partnership.
And I was going to say, it's also a developmental process for families. We can't expect them to come in on day one after, especially when I work with young children, we're looking at identifying disabilities, and all of a sudden they're learning about all of their rights and all these things going on at once. And then we say to them, we want them to lead, and say, well, what are the outcomes or goals you want for your child? And they're not prepared yet. We as professionals need to really build their confidence and competence in the system and in the program, and that builds over time. And so I think as a professional, or if you're an advocate, really helping that family learn slowly in styles that they work with, that they've built, and slowly build that confidence and understand that they do have that equal voice, and how do I learn to share that voice, And it may not happen at the first IEP meeting or even the third or fourth IEP meeting, but slowly building that over time is really important. And again, we want to build that over time so that when they're not working with us anymore because they've moved on to a new IEP team or, to a different school or they've moved, that they now have that confidence to be an equal member and be a leader of their child's team. So just like anyone else, we want to build those skills and see where they are and where they need to go and how to support that. So I think we maybe have time for one more question.
We're out. It's 4:31.
I know we're out of
We
questions.
took it all.
Throw us out. Yeah.
Yeah. We will. You all have been great. We can stick around for a couple of minutes if you have questions you want to throw in the chat box. But this has been fantastic. Thank you for engaging. We appreciate it so much. Youngbach, thanks for running the technology. We wouldn't be here without you. We appreciate you so much. And I hope you all have a good week. And hey, if you have other ideas for these, we would love to get our colleagues to engage more in these practice series. So Dr. Weglarz-Ward was brave and put this topic out there, and I think it was a great one. And if you've got other ones that you think we can cover, let us know, and we'd be more than happy to see if we can put these out, put these together.
And
awesome.
I would also be so bold to think about that we could be including, family members as presenters and also professionals. So as we move forward with this series, kind of bringing in new presenters and voices would be great. Our contact information is available obviously through the university, but will also be on the handout. So you're welcome to contact us all if you have follow-up questions or need more information or want to have anything else that we've talked about today. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. We know it's valuable. Have a wonderful rest of your fall feeling kind of day. Thank you.
Thank you all.